Hello, this is Dr. Antoinette Linton, and in this video, I want to talk about something that I call lesson integrity. We will define this concept and then walk you through the process that I've developed to make sure that your lessons are student-centered and accessible to all learners. So let's get started. Hello, this is Dr. Antoinette Linton, and in this video, I want to talk about something that I call lesson integrity. We will define this concept and then walk you through the process that I've developed to make sure that your lessons are student-centered and accessible to all learners. So let's get started. The idea of lesson or unit integrity is a concept taken from the engineering concept of structural integrity. Structural integrity is an engineering field that helps ensure that either a structure or a structural component is fit for purpose under normal operational conditions and is safe even should conditions exceed that of the original design. The key words here are that we ensure that something is fit for purpose under normal operational conditions and is safe even should conditions exceed that of the original design. Lesson and unit integrity is a concept that describes how we ensure that learning experiences are designed in such a way that they are fit for purpose under normal learning conditions and safe even should conditions exceed that of the original lesson. We cultivate people's cognition for a living and help people develop habits of mind to solve problems. In my case, I help pre-service teachers solve problems of teaching and learning by creating and sharing tools to stabilize knowledge, facilitate socialization, and develop skills. PK through 12th grade teachers help students solve problems across the disciplines. The purpose of doing this is the purpose of schooling, which is to provide for the unique needs of diverse populations of students by A, providing a strong sense of personal, group, and community identity, B, a balanced historical perspective making note of contributions of those who are often overlooked, C, a positive reality of ethnic group status, D, a productive and engaging vision for the future, and E, a desire for excellence in academic, social, and intellectual preparation. To make this video productive for the user, I want you to think about a lesson you are currently teaching or are about to plan. Write down the steps of this lesson and make sure that you have an introduction, some level of knowledge transfer or gathering experience, a chance to talk, write, hear, and read with others, and then some type of assessment. You may want to pause the video here as you do this activity. I will be using the following world language example from a general pedagogy student of mine. Keep in mind that this video can be used across grades and disciplines. This is just an example I think would engage everyone, even though I'm a secondary science educator. Here you have an introduction, an informal assessment, an engagement activity, a time for students to explore, and the application in the real world. For all intent and purposes, this is a logical flow for this lesson, but it's missing a lot. It's not giving lesson integrity at all. I'm going to introduce you to 4 concepts you will practice over the course of the program so that whenever you plan for a learning experience, you can feel confident that you are planning with the students in mind. The four concepts are learning cycles, universal design for learning, or UDL, epistemic practices, and finally cognitive rigor in the Hess matrix. These four concepts will help you make decisions about how to support all students, and then it provides you with a solid foundation to ground your developing planning process. After a while, you will develop the habit of mind to tie back to these concepts whenever you plan for your current or future students. Let's begin with the concept of learning cycles. Planning must start somewhere, and here at CSU Fullerton's Secondary Science Program, it is important that we start with a learning cycle to guide our work. The learning cycle guides you to think deeply about the sequence of learning experiences you want the students to engage in. In the following slides, I will introduce you to a number of learning cycles that you can choose from when beginning your lesson or unit. We will start with the 5E model for learning. Then next we will discuss experiential learning cycles, guided inquiry learning cycles, creative, and then end with the Gibbs reflective cycle. These cycles are not meant to be linear. They are meant to be iterative and spiral, depending on what your students need. You can go with the flow of the phases, or you can double back to previous learning experiences if the students' needs are being met. The information in this evidence-based practice is based from the BSCS and Roger Bybee. The 5E learning cycle is a phase-based theory of learning that happens a great deal in science courses. Teachers choose an engagement activity that is related to the concept of a phenomenon that students are to learn. Then the student receives opportunities to explore the experience where they are trying to learn as much as possible about the topic. Once the students have had efficient time to explore, the teacher plans time for students to explain what they are learning. This is the point where students' ideas, prior knowledge, funds of knowledge are used to make sense of the first two phases. The teacher makes a point to make the explanations public, and the students come up with a consensus. It is then that the teacher introduces a new problem to solve using the consensus explanation that the students have created. And in the process of making this public, you want to put this on the whiteboard. You want to put this on an overhead. You want to put this in somewhere in the classroom where you can construct something in the moment when the kids are explaining what they're understanding, so that all kids have access to the information. Once all the information is gathered, that's when the students need to make a consensus model. This sequence can take a number of tries before students get to the elaboration phase of the 5E learning cycle. Remember, this is not a linear process. You as the teacher are trying to hear and observe how students are engaged with each other, with the curriculum, the materials they are working with. You are listening for misconceptions, preconceptions, accurate knowledge, translanguaging, and other developmental factors that affect student learning. If need be, go back to a previous step or change a step to reflect student learning. Pedagogies that are common with this learning cycle are back pocket questions when students are learning in groups. That is, a teacher kind of formulates these kind of back pocket questions when they're seeing kids engage and listening to the discourse. They'll pull out some questions, or they'll memorize some questions to have kids go deeper. Making explanations public for students to observe and think about. Demonstrations and models as engagement items. Laboratory work to explore. Model building to explore, explain, elaborate, and evaluate. Argumentation as an evaluation tool. Data collection, organization, and analysis. And then negotiation of expository text. This learning cycle was developed by David A. Kolb and provides a way for students to become more self-determined in how they engage in learning. There are 4 stages to this theory: concrete, reflective observation, abstract conceptualizing, and active experimentation. These 4 stages of learning typically move through a cycle that begins with students having a concrete experience and ends with them actively experimenting with the knowledge they have gained. It is the teacher's responsibility to choose a concrete experience that resonates with the students and is complex enough so that when they reflect and think about the experience, they have more questions than they do answers. Very important. It's very important with this learning cycle that you plan times where students share out what their ideas are so that they can compare them with other students. Making ideas public and organizing them in a way that is accessible to students is extremely important. Lesson and unit plans that use this learning cycle include the following pedagogies: whole class discussions, observing the teacher doing a demonstration, observing and taking notes of a well-chosen anchoring phenomenon or video or an example of a topic. Group projects where there is guided student discussion. Presentation, model building and descriptions, and argumentation. Guided inquiry learning is best suited when students are engaged in independent research. Students are co-constructing their understanding of a topic with others, much like professionals would do in a discipline. So this is not teacher-led. The teacher is there to guide the students through the research process, but they are also responsible to teach them the research process. That should be made explicit, right? So if you want them to engage in some level of independent research, you have to actually teach them the process of the research you're trying to engage them in. To be very explicit about the goals, the process, the practices that are involved in the type of research you want them to complete, there should be a lesson that you teach that gives them an overview of what the subject-specific research is. Secondly, you give the students examples and small research projects to complete so that they develop some level of prior knowledge of the process before having them swim in the deep end of a disciplinary research pool. In the older grades, you may hear teachers talk about, well, they should have learned how to do this in their previous grades. I'm here to tell you, some of their teachers don't know how to do this either. So how would they be able to teach them in the previous grades? So do not assume that you don't have to teach the steps or give them age-appropriate ways to learn how to engage in guided inquiry. Pedagogies that are common to this learning cycle: research projects, negotiation of expository text, developing art research, project-based learning that happens across units, problem-based learning projects that happen across units. The creative learning cycle is a description of how kindergarten students engage in creative knowledge construction and problem solving. Developed by Mitchell Resnick of the MIT Media Lab, the researcher and his team study how young people engage creatively in online environments and apply this knowledge by building a website, resources, and supportive community to engage students and teens to create for themselves things from scratch. This approach to learning focuses on 4 P's of creative learning: projects, which provide a way to contextualize the learning for imagining, design, making, performing. The focus is on student expression. The second P is passion. Teachers make sure that the work that students do is meaningful, relevant to their lives and values. It is the whole child: emotions, socialization, talents, gifts, curiosities, being with peers that we tie to this work. Not because it's a part of the standards or the curriculum or the district wants us to do this. Teachers really have to figure out the right balance with this tenet. Peers, the people the students form relationships with, interact and collaborate with when they engage in the project. Make sure these groupings are productive, but at some time the students at the secondary level, at least, should be able to pick their own teams. Through these interactions, students learn new things, they grow, they share ideas. Teachers provide feedback and support for ideas. We go out of our way to get the materials and finances to support the students as well. Finally, play. This results from the teacher creating a learning environment that is safe for all students. They get to enjoy working with one another without social or emotional challenges. Safe classrooms where having a good time while learning enables imagination and creativity to flourish in a spirit of interest and exploration while engaged in projects and social interactions. The Gibbs Reflective Cycle was developed by a Graham Gibbs in 1988 to give structure to learning from experiences. It offers a framework for examining experiences, and given its cyclic nature, lends itself particularly well to repeated experiences, allowing you to learn and plan from things that either went well or didn't go well. We have description of the experience that students engage in. They describe their feelings and thoughts about the experience. They evaluate the experience, both good and bad. We guide them through analysis to make sense of a situation. We form conclusions about what we learned and what you could have done differently. We develop action plans for how you would deal with similar situations in the future, or general changes you may find appropriate. Pedagogies that work well with this reflective cycle include whenever you introduce something new to your students, you ask questions like, describe just what happened. How do you start this process, or how do you end it? What did you learn from this experience? Do you feel confident with using this process now? When would you engage in this process? Therefore, anytime you would introduce an epistemic practice is a good time to use this. Anytime you're introducing academic routines or classroom routines, this is a good process to use. For this slide, we ask ourselves what's missing from the original list of steps in this lesson. So we're going to apply a learning theory to it, a lesson cycle to it. I will be using the 5 E's to fill in what is missing from this lesson. Remember that the 5 E's are engage, explore, explain, elaborate, and evaluate. There is an engage in this list. There's an explore, but that's it. So we have to think deeply about what we want the students to be able to do and know through this learning experience. Now let's take a look at the 5E version of our lesson. The components that were added are in bold so that you can see them easily. We've added an opportunity for students to share what they are learning in the explain portion of the lesson. Then we extended the lesson so that we can apply what we are learning in a novel situation. That's what extend is. The explore, explain, and extend sections of this lesson could go on for days before we get to the evaluate section of the lesson. We need to remember that this process is not linear. I'm going to keep repeating that. And that the teacher should make adjustments depending on the needs of the students. So we've extended the lesson, made it a little more robust here. And the engagement's the same, explore is the same, but now students get an opportunity to share their conversation in Spanish with fellow peers. Use the translated conversation in the real world. for their extend portion. And then they come back and discuss what the challenges and successes were for their evaluate. Tool 2, Universal Design for Learning. Universal Design for Learning is a planning approach that focuses on needs of diverse students throughout the planning process, instead of waiting until the end of the process to make modifications to a lesson or a unit. UDL asks teachers to think about 3 principles: representation, expression, and engagement. This is related to how students interact with and communicate with content. During your time here in our program, you will learn about these 3 principles. You will identify examples of the principles in your work and reflect on how you will be able to use this approach to meet your needs of your future students. Principle 1, which is representation, that's the one in the middle. Teachers consider how they can provide students with multiple representations of information. These representations should have multiple modalities: visual, auditory, kinesthetic, bright, beautiful, colorful, as creative and diverse as the kids are. And include opportunities for students to interact with the information in nonverbal ways as well. In order to ensure that there are expression features of your lesson, you will need to ask yourself some questions. Are there multiple assessment measures to measure student learning? Is there discourse? Is there writing? Is there traditional assessments? Are there performance assessments? Are the assessments in your lesson that do not require students to write or speak as the only means of communication? Are there practical demonstrations of learning in addition to or in place of more traditional quizzes or tests? To identify if there are representations available that are meaningful to students, you will need to ask yourself some of these questions, such as: who are my students? What are their strengths? What do they have difficulty with? What specific concept or content students need to learn from this learning experience? Are there multi-level, multi-sensory materials with which students can engage to understand the content better? Is there other ways to learn the material besides visual, auditory? Are there ways in this lesson for students who are not literate in the language of instruction, but they can still learn the content and concepts? And finally, when identifying the engagement portion of your lesson, make sure to ask yourself the following questions. Are there multiple lesson formats beyond lecture? Games, simulations, role play, demonstrations, experiments, computer, or web-based lessons? Are students working in groups, pairs, independently, and in cooperative groups? Are there specific teaching strategies to support individual students with specific needs? So now we're back to our our world language lesson. This includes the UDL portion. We begin to ask the questions to help us make the lesson accessible. For representation, what specifically do the students need to learn from this lesson? What is the key concept, the content my students need to understand? The answer to the question is that we want them to become fluent in the target language and to be able to make decisions about language use and conversation, to be understood and to understand others in conversation. For expression, have I included practical demonstrations of learning in addition to traditional assessments? For engagement, have I varied the instructional arrangement so that students are working independently with partners? Working independently, or if they're working with partners, are they in small groups? Are they in cooperative groups? And do I bring them back together in a large group to provide additional support if they need it? These questions guide the UDL changes to our working learning episode. As we go through our tools, the learning experience becomes more robust. So if you can tell, there's where there was an informal assessment, now we have an engagement, first to themselves and then with a partner. So individually and then with a partner. For the engagement activity, we put in a representation. We have multiple ways for students to see, hear, say, and write what they want to say in their first language and then the target language. In the Explorer, we add another representation. How might you have this conversation informally? In the Explain, we have expression. Have students and teachers demonstrated how they will go about using the target language. Then we have Extend, and then we have Evaluate. So I want to show you, as the lesson is developed and as you're using your concept tools, your lesson is getting more robust. So we added the 5 E's at first, and now we're doing our UDL second. Now, epistemic practices. This is my jam. This is my research, right? The use of epistemic practices is your third tool. So an epistemic practice is a key procedure or conceptual structure carefully crafted from subject-specific practices that meaningfully engage students in critical thinking as defined by the norms of the profession. They must be well-defined, taught explicitly, and used over time with the intention of students using the practices without being prompted. In secondary science, well, in all science really, there are 4 practices: experimentation, modeling or engineering design, argumentation, and expository text. And you can read about how these became like the key procedures in proficiency in science, assessment challenges and opportunities in the Journal of Science, and this was 2013. So, skill-based procedures include the first 2 epistemic practices, negotiation of expository text. Now, what I want you to notice is that these are the science and engineering practices, but they are organized in such a way as to make sense out of the epistemology that you're looking to have students do. Basically, the practices that define the profession. So when they are reading science text and working and taking notes from science text, they should be asking questions. They should be obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. They should be constructing explanations from the text. They're not doing that. They're not negotiating expository text. Argumentation. Here are the science and engineering components for that. They need to be asking questions. They need to be collecting, organizing, and analyzing data. They need to be using mathematical and computational thinking at times. They need to be constructing explanations and engaging in argumentation from evidence. You take out one of these things, students are going to have a very hard time doing argumentation. Modeling is our third, our engineering design. You're asking questions, you're developing, and you're using models. You're modifying models as you collect data. Data should be on here. Data collection should be here. And then you construct an explanation. Usually argumentation and modeling go hand in hand because you formulate a best fit argument because you've developed a best fit model. And then last, what all science folks and social science folks too engage in is experimentation or inquiry. So we ask questions, we plan and carry out investigations, we collect, organize, analyze, and interpret data, we draw conclusions, and then we either make a model or an argument. In world language, because we're using a world language example, this was a epistemic practice that the world language students developed called facilitating conversations. So they engage in the first language first, translate the version in a target language, practice conversation in a target language, and then use the conversation in the real world and then refine. So let's go back to our world language example and check for the epistemology, right? Are kids using their first language? Let's see. Have students in groups use their first language? Check. Are they translating in their target language? That's the explore part. Check. Are they practicing that language and then able to use it in conversation in the real world? That's explain and extend. And then the evaluate part is for them coming back and making their modifications. So by us doing the 5E first, doing the UDL, the epistemic practice of this particular lesson is pretty solid. But if something were missing, you would add it to the lesson. Tool 4, cognitive rigor and the Hess matrix. This last and final tool allows you to check for cognitive rigor and if things are out of place. So you want to start with your cognitive load low. That's why we would like for kids to recall. But by the end of the lesson, they're creative and they're using information in novel ways. So the fourth or the last step of your lesson should be more cognitively rigorous than the first, obviously. The third step should be more cognitively rigorous than the second. And you determine the cognitive rigor of each line of your lesson and then determine if the flow is appropriate. Now, how do we include the cognitive rigor in our world language example? The first thing you want to do is have a copy of your Hess matrix nearby so that you can check where each line falls in the rigor or the taxonomy of the Hess matrix. And then you either rearrange your lesson, the lines in your lesson, to meet the appropriate cognitive load of your students. So let me show you what that looks like. So I've simplified it here. So we still have our introduction. We put in some modality things, photos, words, repeat. We have this informal assessment, which is a recall. So that's domain of knowledge 1. And then our engagement activity, students talk in groups in their first language. That's also domain knowledge 1. The explain is how we measure if they understand. That's DOK 2. And then the create and, well, first of all, okay. So in extend, we say somebody wrote, create a skit and use the translated conversation in the real world. Well, that's create. Then they come back and discuss what challenges and successes. This needs to be also a create, right? Because the create and extend is cognitively more rigorous than the apply, which is DOK2 for evaluate. So if we're creating here, we're going to have to come back and create again to have this flow cognitively. If you have any questions about the 4 tools and how we use them to plan, please feel free to email me at your earliest convenience. But what I'm hoping that you will do is practice using some of these tools as a way to build confidence in your planning process. That's super important. Here's some points to ponder. Designing effective plans for all students is not an easy task. There's a great deal to interpret and translate: UDL, theory, Hess matrix, differentiated pedagogy for diverse groups, and technology. Find your pedagogical voice within these tools. Not all of them will speak to you all the time, but the ones that do will give you the predictive power to plan for a student challenge and to take a compassionate professional perspective when students do struggle. This concludes the video on lesson and unit integrity. Please feel free to email me if you have any questions. Take care.